Okay, so somewhere between Saturday morning cartoons and whatever we're watching now, the villain stopped being a guy in a cape laughing at nothing and became the most interesting person in the room. And I need to talk about that, because at some point you stopped rooting against the villain and started asking questions. Uncomfortable questions. Like, wait, is he wrong though? And then immediately feeling weird about it, which means something changed. Not in the villains, in how we're being shown them. Let's get into it. The old model, old school villains, and I'm talking classic, foundational, before anyone tried, were evil the way a traffic cone is orange, just completely, unconditionally, from birth, committed to the bit, no backstory, no motivation beyond wants power or wants to destroy everything. You'd ask why, and the answer was essentially, because villain, which, fine, efficient, gets the job done. Kids don't need Freud, but here's the problem. A villain with no reason is just an obstacle, a very dramatic obstacle, sure, but still. You're not thinking about them. You're just waiting for the hero to punch them. They are a plot device with a costume. The story isn't about them. They're the reason the story needs a hero, which means the moment the hero shows up, the villain is already irrelevant. That worked for a while. It worked for a long time, actually. And then it didn't. The shift. At some point, writers started asking a stupid, obvious question that nobody had apparently thought to ask before, which is, why does this person want to do this? And everything changed. Because the moment you answer that question honestly, not because evil, but actually, genuinely, with a real human reason, the villain stops being an obstacle and starts being a person. A wrong person, maybe. A person making terrible choices, probably, but a person, and people are interesting. Obstacles are not. So now you have villains with dead families, failed systems, betrayed ideals, justified grievances, correct diagnoses with insane prescriptions. Now you have villains who looked at the same world the hero looked at and came to a different conclusion about what needed to happen, which is, if we're being honest, way more disturbing than a guy in a cape laughing at nothing. The same goals problem. Here's where it gets actually uncomfortable. Pay attention. Heroes and villains in most modern stories want the same things: justice, freedom, peace, recognition, protection of the people they love. That's it. That's the whole list. They're working off identical source material. The difference, and this is the part that should bother you, is how far they're willing to go. The hero draws a line and says, "Not past here." The villain looks at that same line and says, "That line is why nothing ever changes." And then they cross it. And now you have to actually argue with them instead of just rooting against them. Because you can't just say, "You're evil" anymore. They're not evil. They're wrong, which is different. Wrong can make a case. Wrong has a logic. Wrong can sometimes sound really, really right in the first 10 minutes before everything falls apart. Think about every villain you've actually remembered after the credits rolled. Everyone you talked about later. Everyone you, maybe in a dark moment, slightly agreed with before catching yourself. They all had a point. A broken, dangerous, going to get everyone killed point. But a point. That's not an accident. That's craft. The "I'm the hero" problem. The best villains, and I mean genuinely, structurally, technically the best ones, don't think they're villains. This is not a new observation, but it keeps being true, so I'm saying it again. They think they're the protagonists of a story that everyone else is too cowardly or stupid to be part of. They've done the math, they've looked at the situation, they've concluded that the sacrifice is worth it, the ends justify the means, and the people calling them monsters just haven't thought it through hard enough yet, which means arguing with them requires you to actually argue. You have to counter the logic, not just the label. And the logic is often annoyingly coherent up until the point where they're willing to do something that you're not. That's the line. Not intelligence. Not even morality in some abstract sense. It's what you're willing to do to other people in service of being right. The villain crossed that line. The hero didn't. That's the whole story. And here's the thing. Sometimes the hero's restraint costs them. Sometimes the villain's lack of restraint works. Sometimes the villain, in the short term, wins. Because that's how it actually goes sometimes. And a story that acknowledges that is more honest than a story that doesn't. The mirror problem. Here's the thing that makes the good villain formula actually unsettling. You can see yourself in some of the choices, not the big ones, not the willing to level a city ones. I mean the early ones, the ones that made sense at the time. The moment where they were just a person with a legitimate grievance who made one decision that felt justified. You've made decisions like that. Smaller stakes, obviously. You're not out here committing atrocities. But the logic, this situation is wrong and I'm going to fix it and I'm going to do whatever it takes, logic. That logic lives in normal people. It lives in everyone. And the good villain story takes that logic and just follows it. Further than you would go. Further than you should go. And the horror isn't that the villain is alien and incomprehensible. The horror is that the path from where they started to where they ended up has visible steps. You can trace it. You can see every decision. That's what makes you uncomfortable, not the destination. The route. The answer to the question. So when did the villain start making sense? When storytellers started caring about the answer to why. That's it. That's the whole thing. Someone decided that because evil was lazy and started writing reasons instead. And now we're here, arguing about whether fictional mass murderers had valid points, which, to be clear, they did not. But we're having the argument, which we weren't before. audiences got more interested in complexity than in clear-cut good versus evil, which might say something about audiences, or might say something about the world being complicated enough that simple moral sorting no longer feels honest. Probably both. Doesn't matter. The point is that motivation replaced label as the primary tool for defining a villain. And once that happened, the villain became the most interesting character to write, because the hero has to be roughly right. The villain can be wrong in any direction they want. What this doesn't mean, understanding why a villain does something, is not the same as agreeing with them. I feel like this needs to be said clearly because apparently it needs to be said clearly. I understand the logic is not, the logic is correct. I can see how they got there, is not, they were right to go there. Comprehension is not endorsement. The two things are completely separate, and conflating them is a failure of basic reasoning that a lot of people seem very committed to having. The most memorable villains are the ones you understand because understanding something is what actually lets you disagree with it properly. If the villain is just evil, you can dismiss them. If the villain has a coherent worldview, you have to actually engage with that worldview and explain what's wrong with it, which is harder and more useful. The final thing. The line between hero and villain is usually thinner than the story makes it look. Same goals, same frustrations, same breaking point somewhere on the horizon. The difference is who crosses it and who doesn't, and sometimes the difference is luck. Circumstances, someone being there at the right moment to pull them back. Sometimes the hero is the hero because they had better support systems, not because they were built differently, which means the villain isn't always showing you a monster. Sometimes they're showing you a version of the protagonist who didn't get the same breaks. And that is why the villain started making sense. Because making sense is the scariest thing you can do to an audience. 6 broken moral compasses out of 1 working one that nobody listens to anyway. Moving on.